Welcome to the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson, and this podcast series is a conversation with Matt, the Bearded Naked Yogi. In this 10-episode series, we're delving deep into the core principles of yoga, shedding light on its ancient wisdom and timeless teachings. Matt is taking us through the 8 limbs of yoga, sharing his philosophy and revealing the essence of this ancient practice. Matt, this is episode 4 of the series. What are we covering this time around?
So this time around, we are moving through the 8 limbs of yoga, and we have arrived at Asana, the 3rd limb of yoga, and perhaps the most famous and most recognizable of the 8 limbs. So Asana. Asana is a Sanskrit word that has become associated in the modern world with the many different physical postures that are associated with the practice of yoga. And asana is one of those things. Everybody knows what a downward facing dog is. Everybody knows what a child's pose is. Everybody knows that most wonderful of postures, the shavasana pose. I think what many people perhaps wouldn't know is that translating from Sanskrit, asana literally means sitting down.
Now, sitting down sounds like exactly the kind of yoga that I could get into, but why is sitting down considered to be one of the 8 limbs of yoga?
Sitting down is one of the most perfect things you could ever do in terms of your asana practice. And I'll give you a little historical fact here. You know I like my history. So if you look back at some of the oldest texts that recorded asana, the physical postures of yoga, most of them are concerned with a correct seated posture, cross-legged in lotus pose, lots of weird and fantastical things. Cockerel posture. Look up cockerel posture next time you're on Google. Fabulous pose. And these postures were associated primarily, and still are, as a means of training the body. And it's a training of the body in order to find those still and steady and strong seated postures. The original purpose behind asana was that the body can be prepared for extended periods of sitting down, everyone's favorite kind of yoga. And that sitting down was done with the purpose of applying oneself to meditative practices, breathing exercises, which we'll discuss in the next episode. It is a method of physical discipline. And that physical discipline of asana helps the body to grow its natural capacity in terms of strength, certainly in terms of flexibility, which perhaps in the modern world yoga is most associated with. But asana also has wonderful effects upon the body of relieving any aches, any pains, and according to some scientific studies, they can help with various physical ailments that would otherwise interrupt that meditative seated practice of the yogi. Now, fundamentally, the practice of asana is the holding of the body in specific postures, your downward facing dog, your warrior two, any seated pose, or the twisting postures. And it's done in order to promote that strength and flexibility. But also, once again, we come back to that word awareness. Awareness of how the body feels within these postures. Awareness of how the breath behaves within these postures. And perhaps most importantly of all, an awareness of your mind. So, if you've never stretched your hamstrings before, let's take a posture known as Paschimottanasana. It's known as the intense westward facing stretch. It's simply sitting on the floor with the legs extended in front of you, the toes are pointing to the sky, and it's simply folding forward and reaching the fingers towards your toes. Now, if you've never done that, or you don't have any experience or practice of doing that, that's a very interesting and a very intense sensation within the body, particularly in the area of the hamstrings. And when we come into some of these postures, the mind starts to play its little games. It says that it doesn't like it. It doesn't like these sensations, and it goes off on its crazy little story, telling you all sorts of things. And this is where that awareness becomes important, is that asana teaches us, perhaps in a very physical way, that even though sometimes experiences and sensations are, I don't like the word unpleasant or things like that, but perhaps let's say they're interesting. Oh, that's an interesting sensation when I stretch out my hamstrings. Oh, that's an interesting sensation when I stretch out my hips. And it's that awareness of sensation. It's the awareness of the behavior of the mind that means what you're practicing in asana is directly related to what you would practice within your life. Being in a situation that may be slightly uncomfortable, there's nothing wrong with it. Just breathe through it. Practice, practice, practice. Before you know it, you've got lovely long hamstrings and you're able to touch your toes no matter what position you may be in.
It sounds a little bit aspirational, but you also touched on the sort of... No, my toes are a long way away, I'm telling you. But
aspirational is a really good word when it comes to asana.
Now, you touched on the history of all of this, and I'm interested, I guess, have these poses evolved over time, or are we still effectively doing the same things that people have been doing for thousands of years in the world of asana?
Probably not, to be honest. If we look back once again at the historical record of yoga, and we're talking about asana specifically here, there were originally only 84 postures that were recorded that any practitioner of yoga would do in order to develop that strength and the flexibility of the body and that ability to sit in stillness for long periods in order to cultivate their meditative practices. And what's happened since back then is we can think of yoga as a living, and it's an ever evolving tradition. And as time has gone on, hundreds of years have passed since that original recording. New postures have been developed. They've been developed by teachers, they've been developed by rishis and sages, and they have become part of this incredible library that we have of the physical postures that are associated with yoga. It's very interesting, perhaps as well, to look back to around and about the middle of the 18th century, when the British were in India and they influenced the society of India at that point, and very much developed a doctrine of what we would call physical culture. And at that point, we can clearly see that the physical practices of yoga started to be developed at an exponential rate. Before that, yoga was seen primarily this path of liberation, getting to know oneself, understanding oneself, and the physical postures were there as a kind of add-on, I think. They were there, again, for no other reason than to make the body strong, flexible, steady, get rid of your aches and pains, and feel comfortable sitting. What's happened, I think, since then, and again, this is my opinion here, when yoga sort of exploded in the West and in the modern world, asana is a very visual practice. You can see when someone is practicing yoga, and we are very visual creatures, I think, and we like to look at beautiful things, and many of the postures of yoga are phenomenally beautiful. And I think because of that, perhaps because of a mentality we have within the West, the practice of asana has become the predominant limb in terms of yoga. It's not often you will find, or let me flip that on its head before we go. You can find a class of physical yoga, asana practice, wherever you are. Absolutely wherever you are. And if you can't find it in your town, you can go onto YouTube, you can sign up to any one of hundreds of websites across the world, and you can immediately do a physical yoga class. It's incredibly popular, and I applaud that. But you try finding a class that's associated with pranayama, the breathing exercises. You try to find a specific class, certainly within studios across the world, that is a class that focuses upon the yamas or the niyamas, some sort of philosophical discourse. These things are much more difficult to find, I think. Now, whether or not that's because we as human beings really embrace the physicality of asana practice and enjoy making these wonderful shapes with our bodies, Perhaps are we a little bit wary of delving into ourselves too deeply, examining ourselves a little bit too deeply? I don't have the answer to that, but maybe find out for yourself and let me know.
You talked about the visual appeal of some of the more innovative asana poses, and I guess that's why we see a lot of them on Instagram as well. But some of the guys that I follow seem to be absolute contortionists, and that puts me off a little bit.
I think anything that you see on social media, you know, we're both adults, we know this. You have to look at it and look at it with a critical eye. Asana practice is beautiful. Asana practice lends itself to some incredible photographs, absolutely stunning, and it is beautiful. Do you need to be a contortionist to do it? No. But I will tell you one thing. Many of the people that have embraced yoga do have a background in these more, I don't want to say Western physical disciplines, but thinking about gymnastics and things like that. A lot of dancers do yoga, a lot of gymnasts do yoga. And it's a wonderful thing to have that level of flexibility within the body. And I personally myself, I absolutely admire the discipline that it takes. In my own teachings and in my own practice, and I would say this to anyone that wants to start yoga, you don't need to do any of that. You absolutely don't need to do any of that. If you're starting out in your practice, one of the things that people say to me most frequently, I wish I could do yoga, but I'm not flexible enough. And if I had €1 for every time I heard that, then I'd be a very wealthy man indeed. You don't need to be flexible to do yoga. If flexibility is a goal of yours, then you will achieve that through the consistent practice of yoga. You do not need to be able to do a handstand. And in fact, a handstand is not really part of the traditional canon of yoga postures anyway. Just throwing that out there. Nice little controversial one. Hope to get some emails about that from people. I admire the discipline, but let's not make it anything more than it is. It's standing on your hands. I will say this when it comes to asana practice, you know, and I, sorry if this sounds like I'm sitting here like some wise old sage and all the rest of it. That's the thing, you know, I've been doing this for a long time. And I look back at my own journey through asana practice, the physical postures, and I was desperate to always be getting somewhere. I can now touch my toes. So what's next for me on the physical journey? I can now do a handstand. So what's next for me on this physical journey? I can do the splits. I can do this. I can do this. And there's this real sense of more. What's next? What next is there for me to do? And I had a flash of insight. And I'll steal a word here from our brothers in the Zen tradition, Kensho. And it's a sudden realization. And I was in an asana class and I thought to myself, why are you pushing yourself to the point almost of breaking? Where are you trying to get to with all of this? And that little revelation completely changed my relationship with the physical practice. Now, I like it hard, I like it fast, and I like it strong. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a space for softness. You know, me as a human being, I'm getting older. I'm 45 years old now. My body is changing. Do I see the benefits of me doing the splits or doing a handstand? Maybe I do sometimes, but I also really see this benefit of going, why am I doing this? Turning myself much more towards those meditative practices, which really is the true heart of yoga.
Well, this is the third limb of yoga that we've been discussing in this series. How does asana connect to what we've covered in earlier episodes of this podcast?
Let's have a look at the limbs as overall. So we know that there's 8 limbs of yoga. How I teach is that the first 4 limbs of yoga are there to begin to provide a practitioner of yoga with a sense of discipline towards what they're doing. If you've decided, or as I decided many years ago, and I'm like, okay, I like this yoga stuff, let's see what happens if I take this a little bit more seriously. Perhaps I resonate with the philosophy, I resonate with the practices of this. When we look at the first 4 limbs of yoga, we can see that they can be considered to be very much concerned with providing the yogi with that stable, steady base of which to go on into the second half of the 8 limbs, the final 4, if you like. Asana is there as the truly physical discipline here. If we look back at the yamas and the niyamas that we discussed in previous episodes, they are there to allow a yogi to start to explore who they are within relation to the science of yoga, in who they are in relation to the philosophy of yoga, who they are in relation to themselves, and who they are in relation to the world outside of themselves. And through that, it's all about cultivating this little bit of discipline. You know, we've talked about the principle of brahmacharya, that sense of moderation. That requires a little bit of discipline. To master your asana practice, to get the strength and the flexibility in the body, it requires a little bit of discipline. You know, if you do physical practice of yoga 1 day a week, you'll notice some benefits. If you do it twice a week, you'll notice a lot more benefits. You do it 3 times a week, 4 times a week, maybe every day. What you get out of it is directly proportional to what you put into it. So it's all about cultivating this discipline, cultivating that this is the path that I'm on, this is where I'm going, and these are the initial practices that will support me as a human being, as a yogi, on that journey through yoga.
Well, that brings us to the end of episode 4 of the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at GTV London. If you want to get in touch with Matt or find out more about his online courses and retreats, head over to his website, thebeardednakedyogi.com.
Thank you everyone for listening, and we certainly hope that you'll join us for the next episode. In episode 5 of this series, we are going to be exploring pranayama, the breathing exercises of yoga. Look after yourselves, and namaste.